I'm Zoe, and if someone had told me 4 years ago that my marriage would be hanging by a thread, I'd have laughed in disbelief. But here I am, sitting alone in what used to be our shared bedroom, thinking about where it all went wrong. It was a regular evening at the Hendersons, my in-laws. The dining room was always too warm, and Mrs. Henderson's cooking was, well, an acquired taste. My husband, Michael, was always quiet during these dinners, probably trying to avoid any drama. "Zoe, dear, could you pass the salt?" Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through my thoughts. I obliged, trying to smile. "So, Zoe," she started, eyeing me like a cat does a mouse. "How's your little job at the boutique going?" "It's going well, Mrs. Henderson. We just got a new line of summer dresses in," I replied, trying to sound upbeat. "That's nice. A real career woman," she said, the sarcasm dripping from each word. Michael shot me a look, his way of saying, "Just ignore her." The conversation was superficial until Mrs. Henderson, with a glass of wine in hand, decided it was time to drop her bombshell. "You know, Michael, Jenna called me the other day. She's doing so well. Just got promoted at her law firm." Michael's fork paused midair. "Mom, we've been over this." "Oh, I'm just saying, it's nice to see young people making something of themselves. Not that running a boutique isn't quaint," she said, her eyes on me. I felt my face flush with anger. Before I could respond, Michael intervened. "Mom, Zoe's doing great at her job. Let's not start this again." Mrs. Henderson shrugged. "I'm just speaking my mind. It's a mother's right, isn't it?" The rest of the meal passed in awkward silence. I helped with the dishes, more out of obligation than desire. Mrs. Henderson watched me like a hawk, commenting on everything from the way I stacked the dishes to how I wiped the counter. "Zoe, you're doing it all wrong. Here, let me," she said, snatching the dishcloth from my hand. Honestly, I don't know what kids these days are taught at home. I bit my tongue, counting the seconds until we could leave. Michael was silent, his usual response to his mother's antics. It was like he put on blinders whenever we were around her. On the drive home, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Michael, your mother is impossible. She criticizes everything I do. Can't you see that?" Michael sighed, keeping his eyes on the road. "She's just set in her ways, Zoe. You know how she is. But it's always about me. She never misses a chance to put me down. And you just sit there and let her. Zoe, please. Let's not do this now. She's my mom. What do you expect me to do?" I stared out the window, feeling a mix of anger and helplessness. Stand up for me, maybe? Just once. Life after that dinner at the Hendersons took a nosedive. It was like living in a slow-moving nightmare. I tried to shake off the feeling, but Mrs. Henderson's words, her disapproval, clung to me like a bad smell. Michael and I were like two ships passing in the night. Our conversations, once filled with laughter and plans for the future, were now just about the mundane: bills, groceries, the weather. I missed him, even though he was right there. One evening, I decided to cook Michael's favorite, spaghetti bolognese. I was in the kitchen, lost in the rhythm of chopping and stirring, when Michael walked in, home from work. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile. "Thought I'd make your favorite tonight." He glanced at the pot and then at me. "Thanks, but I'm not really hungry." I frowned. "You sure? I can keep it warm for later." He shrugged. "Maybe. I've got some stuff to do in the study." As he walked away, I felt a familiar pang of disappointment. I served myself a plate and ate alone at the kitchen table. The next weekend, we were back at his parents' place. I braced myself for another round with Mrs. Henderson. She didn't disappoint. "Zoe, have you gained a bit of weight?" she asked, eyeing me up and down. I clenched my teeth. "I don't think so, Mrs. Henderson." She's scared. "You should watch that. Men like Michael need a wife who takes care of herself." Before I could reply, Michael cut in. "Mom, please." "What?" "I'm just looking out for her," she said, her tone innocent. But the damage was done. The rest of the visit was a blur. I couldn't wait to get out of there. Things didn't improve. Every visit to his parents was a test of my patience. Mrs. Henderson's digs at me became more frequent, more personal. And Michael, he just retreated further into his shell. I started spending more time at work, staying late just to avoid going home to an empty house. My boss noticed and appreciated the extra effort, but it was just a distraction from my crumbling marriage. It was during one of those late nights at work when I got a text from Michael. "Eating with mom and dad tonight. Don't wait up." I stared at the message, my heart sinking. It was happening again, he was choosing them over me. Over us. I didn't wait up. I couldn't. The loneliness and frustration were too much. I cried myself to sleep that night, mourning the loss of what we once had, fearing what our future might hold. The tension at home was like a thick fog, impossible to ignore. Michael and I had been reduced to grunts and nods, barely acknowledging each other's presence. It was a far cry from the love-filled days we used to know. It was late on a Tuesday when things finally blew up. I was in the living room, flipping through a magazine, trying to find some distraction, when Michael walked in, his face like a thundercloud. "Zoe, we need to talk," he said, his voice low. I put the magazine down, feeling a knot in my stomach. "Okay, what's up?" He took a deep breath. "It's about my mom. She called today. She's upset." I rolled my eyes. "What is it this time?" "She said you were rude to her last time we visited. That you ignored her and were disrespectful." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Rude? Disrespectful? Michael, she's been nothing but mean to me since day one. And you expect me to just take it? He frowned. "She's my mother, Zoe. You could at least try to get along with her." "Try? I've been trying for years. But it's never good enough for her, or for you, it seems." Michael's face turned red. "That's not fair, Zoe. I'm stuck in the middle here. I'm doing my best." "Your best?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your best is letting her walk all over me. Your best is taking her side every single time." He stepped closer, his voice rising. "What do you want me to do, Zoe? Cut her out of my life? She's all I have left of my family." "And what about me? Am I not your family too?" He shook his head, frustration etched on his face. "You just don't get it." "No, Michael, you don't get it. You don't see how much this is hurting me. How much you're hurting me." We stood there, glaring at each other, the years of unsaid frustrations boiling over. It felt like a dam had burst, and all the anger and hurt came pouring out. "Maybe you're just like her," he finally said, his voice cold. "Maybe she's right about you." That hit me like a slap in the face. "Right about me? You think I'm the problem here?" He didn't answer, just turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, shaking with anger and disbelief. That night, we slept in separate rooms. The gap between us had turned into a chasm, and I had no idea how to bridge it. I lay awake, replaying the argument over and over in my head, each time feeling more lost and alone. The next morning, the house was like a battlefield, silent and tense. We avoided each other, moving around in a strained dance of avoidance. I left for work early, the need to escape the oppressive atmosphere overwhelming. At my desk, I tried to focus, but my mind kept drifting back to the argument, to Michael's words. It felt like we had reached a point of no return, and I didn't know how to feel about it. When I got home that evening, the house was empty. Michael's car wasn't in the driveway. I went inside, the silence enveloping me like a cold blanket. I sat on the couch, staring at nothing, feeling a deep sense of despair. Hours passed, and there was no sign of Michael. I checked my phone, but there were no messages, no missed calls. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I went to bed that night, but sleep was elusive. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, fears, and what-ifs. The realization that our marriage was crumbling was like a weight on my chest, suffocating me. And as the clock ticked away, marking the passing of another sleepless night, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the end of the road for us. If the love we once had was lost forever in a sea of misunderstandings and unspoken words. Alone. That's how the house felt since Michael left. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder of the gaping hole where our relationship used to be. I tried to keep busy, to fill the void with anything I could. But the emptiness was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Then came the day that changed everything. I was on my way to the grocery store when it happened. A sudden crash, a blur of motion, and then darkness. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, the sterile white of the room assaulting my senses. The doctor's words hit me like a ton of bricks. "I'm sorry, but the injury to your spine, it's severe. Walking again might not be possible." I lay there, stunned. This couldn't be happening. Not now, not when my life was already in pieces. But it was happening. And when I finally returned home, it was to a reality I wasn't prepared for. The house felt even emptier, the walls echoing with the life I used to have. I refused to let despair take hold. I started doing exercises every day, determined to prove the doctors wrong. I would sit in my wheelchair, pushing my legs to move, to feel something, anything. And then there was the painting. I hadn't picked up a brush since I was a teenager, but now, it became my escape. I'd lose myself in the colors and strokes, creating worlds where I was whole again, where my life wasn't defined by the confines of my wheelchair. It was hard, harder than anything I'd ever done. There were days when I wanted to give up, to succumb to the sorrow that threatened to overwhelm me. But I kept going, clinging to the hope that one day, I might stand on my own 2 feet again. My friends and family were there for me, in their own ways. Calls, visits, words of encouragement. But the one person I needed the most, Michael, was a ghost, a part of my life that seemed to have vanished completely. I learned to navigate the world in my wheelchair, to adapt to my new reality. It was a slow, painful process, but I was making progress, finding a new kind of strength within myself. The day Michael came back, it wasn't for the reasons I'd hoped. He stood at the door, a folder in his hand that I knew all too well, divorce papers. My heart sank. But as he saw me in the wheelchair, his expression changed from determined to shocked. "Zoe, I didn't realize it was this bad," he stammered, the papers forgotten for a moment. "Yeah, well, it's been tough," I replied, trying to mask the mix of emotions his presence brought up. He hesitated, then took a step inside. "I came to talk about the divorce, but this can wait. It's not important right now." I was surprised by his reaction. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell him he couldn't just waltz back into my life. But another part, a quieter, more hopeful part, was relieved. From that day, Michael started dropping by. At first, it was awkward, the air heavy with all the things left unsaid. But gradually, we started talking, really talking, for the first time in months. One afternoon, he found me in the living room, surrounded by my paintings. He picked one up, a swirl of blues and greens. "These are really good, Zoe. I didn't know you still painted." I shrugged, feeling a flush of pride. I needed something to do. Helps me forget, even if it's just for a little while. We sat down, and for the first time in a long time, we laughed. It was like a window had opened, letting in the fresh air of our old camaraderie. We talked about everything and nothing, work, friends, a new movie that was out. As the days turned into weeks, Michael's visits became the highlight of my days. We'd talk, laugh, and sometimes just sit in comfortable silence. It was a tentative dance, a slow rebuilding of trust and affection. And with each visit, I felt something shift inside me. The walls I'd built around my heart started to crumble, brick by brick. It was scary, letting him in again, but it also felt right. So we continued, taking each day as it came, each shared laugh and conversation a step towards something new. It wasn't the life we'd planned, but it was a life we were building together, one day at a time. Just when life seemed to be taking a turn for the better, with Michael and I slowly finding our way back to each other, Mrs. Henderson, Michael's mother, decided to insert herself into our lives in the most intrusive way possible. She announced that she was moving in with us, under the guise of wanting to help with my recovery. I was immediately wary, but Michael seemed to think it was a good idea. "Zoe, she just wants to help," Michael tried to reassure me when we first discussed it. "It might be good to have an extra pair of hands around the house." I wasn't convinced. "Michael, you know how your mom is. She's never really liked me." He gave me a hopeful look. "Maybe this will be a chance for you two to bond. She really seems to want to make amends." Reluctantly, I agreed. But it didn't take long for Mrs. Henderson's true colors to show. Whenever Michael was around, she was sweetness personified, always ready with a helpful suggestion or a kind word. But as soon as he left the room, her demeanor changed. It was like dealing with two different people. One afternoon, while Michael was at the store, she came into the living room where I was trying to read. "You know, Zoe, Michael is just staying with you out of pity," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "No man wants a wife who can't even take care of herself." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure. "I think that's for Michael to decide, Mrs. Henderson." She tooted, shaking her head. "I'm just being realistic, dear. It's only a matter of time before he realizes he can do better." Her words were like a knife to my heart, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me upset. "If you're done, I'd like to get back to my book." She huffed and left the room, but her words stayed with me, festering like a wound. I wanted to tell Michael, to let him know what his mother was really like, but I was afraid. Afraid that it would drive a wedge between us again, that he might not believe me, or worse, that he might side with her. So, I kept it to myself, bearing her barbs in silence. It was a lonely, painful experience. Every cutting remark, every snide comment, I absorbed and locked away, a growing weight on my soul. In the evenings, when Michael asked how my day was, I would force a smile and lie. "It was fine. Your mom's been a big help." And he would smile back, relieved that things were going well. But inside, I was screaming, desperate for someone to see the truth, to understand the pain I was enduring. It was a restless night, and sleep seemed to elude me. The house was silent except for the occasional creaks and groans that come with an old building. Then, a murmur of voices from downstairs pierced the quiet. Curiosity piqued, I wheeled myself to the top of the stairs, straining to hear the conversation below. It was Mrs. Henderson and Michael, her voice a sharp whisper that sliced through the stillness of the night. "Michael, look at these pictures. This girl, Laura, she's a teacher, beautiful and healthy. And this one, Sarah, she comes from a good family. You need to think about your future, about having a family." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Was she seriously showing Michael photos of other women? Michael's voice was a low rumble. "Mom, stop this. I'm not interested. I love Zoe." "Love?" My heart fluttered at his words, but Mrs. Henderson's next words froze it again. "But she's a cripple, Michael. She can't give you what you need," Mrs. Henderson hissed. I clutched the railing, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. Her words stung like acid. Michael's voice rose, tinged with anger. "That's enough, Mom. I don't want to hear another word. I love Zoe, and I'm staying with her. This is my decision." There was a pause, and then Mrs. Henderson's voice, now shrill with rage. "You're wasting your life with her. She's nothing but a burden. It would be better if she just..." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Tears blurred my vision, and a sob caught in my throat. "That's it, Mom. Get out of my house. Now." Michael's voice was like thunder, a sound I had never heard from him before. The sound of footsteps and a door slamming jolted me back to reality. I wheeled back to my room as quickly as I could, my mind racing, my heart in turmoil. A few minutes later, Michael came into the room. He looked distraught, his eyes searching mine. "Zoe, I'm so sorry. Did you hear all that?" he asked, his voice breaking. I nodded, unable to find my voice. He moved closer, kneeling beside me, his hands reaching for mine. "I never wanted you to hear those things. My mom's gone. I asked her to leave. I want you to know that I meant what I said. I love you, Zoe, and I'm not leaving you." His words were a small comfort against the backdrop of his mother's cruelty. But in that moment, with Michael holding me, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could get past this, maybe our love was strong enough to withstand even the harshest of storms. The days after Mrs. Henderson was asked to leave brought a sense of calm to our home that I hadn't felt in a long time. Michael and I were finding our rhythm again, slowly piecing together the fragments of our relationship. It was during one of these peaceful afternoons that my phone rang, breaking the tranquility. The caller ID showed Mrs. Henderson's number. With a deep breath, I answered, "Hello?" "Zoe, it's me," came Mrs. Henderson's voice, laced with a tone of distress I wasn't used to hearing from her. "Michael, he's cut me off. After everything I've done, he won't even help me financially." Her words stirred a mix of emotions within me. "Mrs. Henderson, what happened between you and Michael was bound to have consequences. You said some unforgivable things." There was a pause, and then a sob from her end. "But I'm his mother. How could he do this to me?" "Maybe it's time you reflected on your actions, Mrs. Henderson. You pushed him away with your words and actions," I said, my voice steady despite the churn of emotions inside. "But I need his help, Zoe. I have nowhere else to turn." I sighed, feeling a pang of pity but standing firm. "You brought this on yourself, Mrs. Henderson. Michael needs to do what's best for him, for us. Maybe this is a wake-up call for you to start making some changes." The call ended with her in tears, but I knew I had spoken the truth. It was a difficult conversation, but necessary. Turning to Michael, who had been listening quietly, I saw a mix of emotions on his face. "Are you okay?" I asked. He nodded, wrapping me in a gentle embrace. "I am now. It's hard, but I think it's for the best. We need to focus on us, on our future." Our future. The word filled me with hope. We had weathered the storm together, and now it was time to rebuild. "We have a lot to look forward to, Michael. Just the two of us," I said, smiling up at him. He returned the smile, his eyes bright with the promise of a new beginning. "Yes, we do. I love you, Zoe, more than ever." As days turned into weeks, our home became a sanctuary of love and understanding. We talked about our dreams, about starting a family, about moving forward together. The challenges we had faced only made our bond stronger, our resolve firmer. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset from our porch, Michael took my hand. "This feels right, doesn't it? Just us, moving forward together." I leaned against him, feeling the warmth of his presence. "It does. We've come through so much, and now we have a whole future to look forward to. Just us." In that moment, I realized how far we had come. From the depths of despair and loneliness, we had risen together, stronger and more united. Our journey wasn't easy, but it had brought us to a place of understanding and profound love.